What is good, all you cool cats and kittens? This is your Commissioner Tim back on your screen for the Week 11 Power Rankings. Man, Week 10 was a joy to watch as a fan of football. And we got probably, definitely, the game of the year. Um, Man, I think it's the two times in a row where Buffalo Bills, 2 seasons in a row where I think Buffalo Bills had the game of the year. Obviously, last year, the heartbreaking loss overtime for Josh Allen and the Bills in the playoffs. This year, same thing, overtime, sort of, interception. But regardless, the game of the year for the Bills, Brandon's got to be a little heartbroken. But man, it was still really, really fun to watch. And I could say the same thing about how the rest of the season for CCK is shaping up. We're down to just 4 more weeks, boys, until we've got playoffs coming up ahead. And I wanted to obviously do our weekly power rankings and get this out to you as soon as possible. I'm still in Korea. I'll be here, through Thanksgiving, and should be back in time for week 12. Yeah, probably week 12. No, week 13. So I should be able to watch the playoffs and fantasy playoffs at least in person with y'all and continue sort of the trash talk. Okay, that's it. So as we're sort of going into the playoff, I wanted to have this power rankings be a little bit more focused around the playoff pictures and, not to necessarily repeat everything from last week where it was a little bit more numbers based. So I want to try something new. So you'll see it in a little bit. I hope I can sort of do all of this in one take because it's a little bit iffy to just do it on one monitor on a laptop, which is what I'm doing right now. But let's get it started. So I think, just looking at the standings, we're looking at two teams at 8-2. Got Captain Canada sitting 7-3, and then Trust the Process sitting at 6-4. Now 2 games ahead of 4-putt with 4 games left to play. And there's going to be interesting sort of playoff scenario pictures here, but and we'll talk about how Travis and Huge Dicka is able to sort of still maybe potentially get into the playoffs. So it's certainly not locked in yet. That said, the entire seeding of 1 through 4 is not yet decided. Any one of the teams right now within the top 4 can get into the first seed. And even the one sitting at 8-2 in Ryan and Kyle, they can both end up as the 4th seed as well. So all those scenarios are in play, and we'll talk about how that sort of looks for the playoff picture and my thoughts on standings and where we're going to be at the end of the year in terms of the overall seeding and total standings that we've had to date. So let's talk about the playoff race for a second. We're looking at Moncton Meerkats and Brady Star Dynasty. Mathematically, really, Moncton Meerkats has made it mathematically, in there, but Brady Star Dynasty like 99.9%. So I'm just saying both of them are secured here. Cup to Canada has 1 more win. Trust the Process needs to probably go 2 more wins, and Huge Dicka will need to win out the remaining games on the calendar for us in the regular season to have a shot at getting into the playoffs right now. And I wanted to talk a little bit about an interesting dynamic that we're about to see in the next 4 weeks. So let's look at the games remaining, and I'll show you what I mean. All the 5 teams that are in the current race for the hunt for the playoff seed, the only team that faces more than once, it's, one team, how would I say it? The only team that is basically the only manager that's facing more than one other playoff competing teams rest of the season is Brady Star Dynasty, where he's finishing out the remaining all 4 games are against the names here. Whereas everyone else is facing toilet bowl contending teams and rebuilding teams. So it's going to be really, really interesting what that means in terms of the rest of the season standings. The one thing that I just want to sort of talk about too is, it's just another example of everything being Ryan's world and we're just living in it. Or rather, it's sort of, Ryan's simulation as a robot that we just happen to be, partaking in. But I think Ryan and how he does against all of us, the playoff competing teams is going to be what ultimately sets everything from the standings to um, seedings to who gets in and who doesn't. So we're going to talk about those individual sort of scenarios one by one. And this is where I hope I don't mess up because this is the first time that I'm doing this. And we're going to go over to Tier Maker, which probably seen this on YouTube, other sort of fantasy YouTubers sort of doing this. And I'm going to try to do this on a one take, and hopefully I'm able to get this done. And for each team that I sort of work with, I'll sort of chat about their projected standings that I think as well. All right, so let's move over to our tier maker. We're going to start out here for the Brady Stir Dynasty. So our champ here. And right now, like I said, Brady Stir Dynasty is the only manager that's facing more than just one other playoff competing team the rest of the season. So obviously Ryan's worst case scenario is going 0-4, but will still be fourth. And also interestingly enough, if Ryan actually does go 0-4, that actually reduces Travis's playoff chances because all those losses would mean all the wins for the rest of the playoff contenders. And Ryan's already 2 games ahead of Trust the Process, who's currently sitting fourth. I think Ryan needs to go, multiple wins, and probably actually perfect scenario for Travis is going to be that Ryan needs to go 3-1 to close out the season, with the sole loss being against him in this week, in week 11. I've got Ryan rest of the season going 1-3 actually, and I believe Ryan will finish at 9-5, and that would mean that he's tied third. But I think with the tiebreaker, that might mean that he ends up as our 4th seed. So that's how I'm thinking about it. And within Ryan, I have him right here in the playoff tier. It's not going to be important who's number 1, number 2, number 3. This is how I want to do sort of the power rankings, because I think especially, and we'll talk about when this team gets mentioned, but with a lot of changes to the strength of roster to some of the teams, it's less about numbers and how they sort of fit into the tiers. But just to explain this tier section a little bit, contender favorite to me is what I believe is a runaway manager. Going into it. Maybe we have it this season, maybe we don't. You'll have to wait and see. Contender is someone that I believe can still pull out a win and is still considered widely to be a contender, but maybe it's not necessarily a runaway. There may be things that needs to happen. And playoffs are teams that I believe will end up making the playoffs, and they should be able to compete. But I would have them considered as an underdog against the matchups that they face against the players of the teams above their caliber or above their tiers. But obviously, the closer sort of the names of everyone, playoffs contender favorites we have in the tiers, it means that it's going to be more wild and unpredictable once the actual playoffs start. Toilet Bowl is just anyone that's not missing, anyone that basically missed the playoffs by a small margin, and then the reverse, basically, who I think is a toilet bowl favorite, who I think is a toilet bowl contender. Sort of same logic on the playoff side, but on the toilet bowl side now. All right, so we talked a lot about Brady Stir Dynasty and his impact and what it potentially could mean for Huge Dicka. So let's talk about Huge Dicka for a second. I'm going to load him up on the graph here now. So Huge Dicka for me, I think when you're just looking at the numbers, and I shared this last week, the only thing that Huge Dicka is really lacking is just the consistent high-end firepower to be able to compete with the playoff tier caliber teams all season. But it really has been fun seeing the at least one of his players going off on absolutely nuts each and every week for the last what feels like 4 weeks or so, which has been basically the pace of his run so far. His playoff race is certainly not over yet. And I mentioned here, Travis is now down to, I believe, 7% in terms of the playoffs. And depending on how things play out, he may be able to knock out either Trust the Process or even Cup to Canada if he was able to get into that playoffs. The most important thing for him, mathematically, obviously, is just win this week against Brady Stir Dynasty. Sleeper's projection has it to be a relatively even matchup this week. So if any one of his players goes off again, that sets up Huge Dicka for a really interesting run, as he's going to be facing teams that are not looking to contend rest of the season right after that. So there is a very good potential chance that as long as he wins this out, there's a chance for him to win 3 additional straight, making it 4-0 to end the season for him, which will mean that he's sitting at 8-6. And that at that point might be good enough to get into the playoffs, and certainly not even a potential tiebreaker at that point. So it is purely reliant. So there's not a single manager that Travis is more reliant on than how Brady Stir Dynasty does for the rest of the season after this week. Even this week, obviously, he needs to beat him. But if Brady Stir's Dynasty, loses to Trust the Process in week 13, that really, kicks out Travis's window. If Brady Stir Dynasty beats, Eve, and I believe they're facing each other in week 14, for example, that could potentially shut the window. So whatever it is, as long as Travis beats Ryan this week, there is a very, very good chance that, albeit minimum, we might see Travis's playoff probability increasing 1 week at a time, and it may end up going down to the final results of the games in week 14. So just a really, really interesting thing. Number-wise, I'm looking at it. So if Brady Stir Dynasty goes 3-0 to finish, or sorry, if Brady Stir Dynasty goes 3-0 after losing to Huge Dicka in week 11, that is what maximizes the scenario for Huge Dicka to get into the playoffs. At that point, just mathematically, we're still looking at even Huge Dicka, even if he was to go 4-0 for the rest of the season. Even though we're looking at him being 8-6 at that point, mathematically, because of the tiebreakers and other strength of schedules, it still has him likely as a 5th seed and missing it because of the tiebreaker. But that's still 30% of that scenario is what will allow Huge Dicka to potentially make the playoffs. And then in that scenario, I was kind of surprised, but in that scenario, I might have messed some numbers up here, but in that scenario, Huge Dicka has a 30% chance to make the playoffs, which is pretty significant if you think about a team that started out the way that he did and making this end of the season sort of run against teams with obviously much stronger sort of rest of the season roster strength expectations. But anyways, for me, like I said, that playoff race could go as down as, late as week 14 to the final games. That said, okay, so I have Travis going actually 2-2, maybe 3-1, but I've got him finishing with 2-2 with a 6-8 type of a finish, and he's going to be sitting solo 5th for himself. That's sort of my call on where sort of things end up. So I'm going to put him right there in that toilet bowl tier. And then that moves us over to Moncton Meerkats. And so for me, Moncton Meerkats has been looking real human in the midseason. Definitely exposed at the quarterback and tight end positions, and that's where we've been seeing, the vulnerabilities. But it still feels like this team has literally, it's just full of dynamites that can single-handedly carry home Moncton Meerkats' victory, and beyond that, single-handedly potentially have Moncton Meerkats be the highest scoring manager for any given week. It's just a very, very dangerous team, and it's a team that I just would hate to face come playoff time. And it feels like it's just like everything is beyond my control because Saquon or CMC, any of them could go for 30, 40 plus. Lamar could go for 40 plus. And you just have to cross your fingers that it's not one of those weeks, or that out of the 10 starters that he has, you're able to, dodge the bullets of any one of his 10 potentially going off for a massive game there. So for Moncton Meerkats, obviously the best case scenario is still a solo finish first, or solo first finish, it's also the most likely scenario given strength of schedule actually. So predict the rest of the schedule for me on Moncton Meerkats. I've got him going 3-1 to close out the season, and he's likely going to be sitting by himself at 11-3 when everything's sort of said and done as we head into the playoffs. In terms of the power rankings, where I sort of see his abilities come playoff time and his likelihood to win it all, I'm going to stick Moncton Meerkats right there in the contender tier. And then next one, let's move over to Cup to Canada. Obviously a huge loss in terms of the playoff full health, expected roster strength as Cup went out the window. It gets really, really hard to replace that type of production because in that chart last week, I believe Cup was sitting at 20 points for the playoff full strength roster. But the next best up after that, we're looking at probably 12 points for him. So that's almost a swing of 8 points, potentially more, depending on how Terry McLaurin or other people do. But it's absolutely a huge drop off in terms of production. And last week, as I mentioned, I had Eve in his own contender favorite tier because roughly about a 10-point gap between him and the second best, roster strength, which was Kyle. I believe it was like 182 to 175 for Kyle. But with the Cup injury, that actually brings him right down to the same exact tier as Kyle in terms of that strength that we're talking about come playoff time. In terms of my predictions, I've got C2K, Cup 2 Canada, finishing out at a 3-1 and sitting second at 10-4. In terms of the tier, like I mentioned, I've got him in the contender tier. I still got Eve a little bit stronger, just slightly stronger than Moncton Meerkats. But again, the reason we're doing these tier breakdowns is if you're in that tier, you're in that tier. And you probably have the ability to upset, a team above your tier. And it just gets harder if there's a team 2 tiers above you, for example. All right, so trust the process. I'm next. So for me, I think, and this is sort of wraps up the last of the playoff tiers, and we'll go into the toilet bowls. But for me, I think the trust the process, my roster, I think is the wild card. In terms of what it ends up happening. Obviously, as we saw last week, still able to put up league high weeks. And that was great to see, especially paired with Jonathan Taylor coming back and being fully utilized. But right now I'm in the current same tier as Brady's third dynasty. But if you recall from last week's analytics and the actual points on the expected strength come playoff time, the biggest assumptions that were gonna be able to tip me over into this contender tier, same with Moncton Meerkats and now Cup to Canada being in there, it's going to be, hey, does Jonathan Taylor come back strong? Does he get utilized or is he shut down? And if DeAndre Swift is able to sort of come back, and then that kicks it up another gear. I think we saw last week, Jeff Saturday may be the best thing that's ever happened to my, fantasy season. As we saw last week, if JT is healthy, remains healthy, and gets utilized as a bell cow, he had 97% snap share, which is, I believe that's his career high, actually, because he's always had to split time with Nyheim Hines, even though it's, minimal. But 97%, and there's no other players that's going to be able to sort of, take that away. And Jim Irsay, the fact that Jim Irsay allows his man crush of a coach in Jeff Saturday to allow him to start Matt Ryan, then this team, my team, man, jumps right into the contender mix, especially with the acquisition of David Montgomery now, who doesn't have to deal with snap share, I would assume, sharing with Khalil Herbert rest of the season, at least in terms of fantasy playoff implications are concerned. So I think right there, right now, it's a little too early. It's only been 1 week, so we got to sort of see how it gets utilized. So I'm sticking myself in the playoff tier, and even without sort of the JT bump, right now in terms of the power rankings, again, doesn't matter what tier it's in, it doesn't matter what ranking it is, but I think just a slight right now tier without the assumptions that David Montgomery boost, JT boost rest of the season, and DeAndre Swift not doing anything. I'd still have the at third, but the same thing and just playoffs right now. And then within the next 2 weeks, there's plenty of things sort of that's drumming up that potentially could move this up. And it goes the same thing. I would say, actually, now looking at it, both of us, Brady Star Dynasty and myself, in this tier of playoffs, has a chance over the next couple of weeks to shoot up right into the contender tier alongside Cup to Canada and Moncton Meerkats. For Brady Star Dynasty, we're talking about the return of Deshaun Watson and how he stacks up with Amari Cooper, as well as the return of Jamar Chase, assumedly who's going to be healthy once he does come back in time for playoffs. So, for Trust the Process right now, weirdly, like I said, the top 4 teams right now all have a chance to be able to sit solo first. I've got me finishing out at 3-1 for the rest of the season with a final standing of a 9-5, tied for third. Alongside Brady Star Dynasty, but I believe I'll end up winning the points for tiebreaker. So I've got me finishing, just before we go into the toilet bowl section, I've got myself, I got Kyle sitting at 11-3, Eve sitting at 10-5, Trust the Process at 9-5, sitting third, and Brady Star Dynasty sitting 9-5, sitting fourth on tiebreakers. So you can sort of get a picture around what that playoff week 1 may look like. And so that's the playoff picture, and sort of the power ranking so far of the top 5. And let's sort of talk about the toilet bowl teams now. I think with, we saw some trades happening where John picked up Javonte Williams and sent over to David Montgomery. So I think there's a lot of movement already happening, especially given that if Khalil Herbert was out rest of the season in terms of fantasy schedule, then that was going to be quite a boon to John in terms of roster strength. Interestingly enough, this is also the week where we saw, I believe it was John's second high of the year when it came to max points for, and came very close to scoring the league's second highest. But finished still third in the points for week 10. I don't think we're going to necessarily see those types of weeks, obviously, but, over the last 4 weeks, since week 7, the points for averages now has, Sergey being last at 132, Brandon at second lowest, I believe, at 134. And then now full Jerry has been increased to, I think, 140. I'm talking about the max points for, actually. So I'm not going to do anything, tricky or unique here. I think both of them, all of them, there is not a TB toilet bowl favorite, actually. So I'm actually going to be sticking all of these in the same tier. And I think I would probably have, just because it's a reverse order, right? So I've got John as probably the strongest out of these 3. And then I'd probably put Sergey as currently the weakest. But there's not enough that separates between any of these 3 teams at the toilet bowl contender. I do think it's going to be very easy. Whoever ends up getting matched with Huge Dicka in the first week of toilet bowl competition is likely going to guarantee themselves to be able to get into the toilet bowl championship, just because of that 0.4 difference in terms of expected power come playoff time is quite different. So here's the rating for week 11, boys. And as we sort of head into the last sort of stretch, it's going to be quite fun. I actually do love it that we may still have an underdog Cinderella type of a playoff run story. I personally would love to see it. So looking forward to it, and just a reminder: make sure that you factor in the protections for 16 players as we head into the week 12 trade deadline. So it means that we will roughly have about a week plus what, like 2 days, 3 days, because of the Monday night games, whatever it means for your Canada time or U.S. time zone that you're at. The trades can no longer be sent or accepted at the conclusion of the Monday night football game in week 12. And whoever you're left with, the only transaction that's going to be able for you are going to be through the waivers and free agency. So while you can still drop players, understand that if there's any players that you haven't been able to send out before week 12, just factor in the protection list being at 16, because that's who you're ultimately going to have to protect or drop come the expansion draft. So just understand that, bake that all in, and hopefully, and I do expect there to be a lot of different movements happening. All right, boys, enjoy this week, and looking forward to chatting with y'all on Sunday and Monday. Peace.